the next class. This part of forensic psychology deals with psychology and law enforcement. And this is a pretty interesting area of forensic psychology that many people choose to work in. So, an interesting part about working with police departments is that sometimes it's not exactly clear who the client is. Is it the actual police officer that you work for? Is it the police department? Or is it us, the taxpayers, who really contribute to the funding for the police department? So that's the Fort Lauderdale Police Department right there on Broward Boulevard. Some of you might be familiar with that. What would a forensic psychologist do there? And if you think about it, there's lots of different things. So a forensic psychologist might actually be a therapist to a police officer. They might be involved in the selection, evaluation, or training of police officers, or they might develop new programs. But there might be a problem, especially when we talk about assessment of police officers. And the major ethical problem is involved in confidentiality and dual relationships. So confidentiality is a privilege. It's privileged communications that a psychologist is granted with their client. But that last slide indicated that at times we don't really know who the client is. So if it is a police officer and things are kept confidential between the psychologist and the police officer, and the police chief comes in to talk to the psychologist, and the psychologist breaks confidentiality, that might be problematic and unethical. But that said, a police psychologist should disclose all rules of confidentiality before actually working with the police officer. The next one there is dual relationships. And what if you are working with a police officer? They might be hesitant to do so, but let's say they witness a really tragic or horrific crime. Maybe a child was murdered or something like that, and the psychologist was working with the police officer to help them through that traumatic experience. I'm just making that up. But then, later on, the psychologist is asked to perform a fitness for duty evaluation. There really is a conflict in that scenario because there's a dual relationship. Is the person supposed to be unbiased in their evaluation for that officer's fitness for duty? Or are they biased because they've been working as that individual's therapist? It's an interesting thing to consider. Okay. So, forensic psychologists are involved in the selection of police officers, and if you look at this slide, forensic psychologists might not be involved in all of these things. The first thing is a police civil service examination. Forensic psychologists probably are not going to be involved in administering that. Review of academic records, tax returns, employment, or military records. Again, probably no involvement there either, nor with background checks, or a medical or physical fitness evaluation. Where forensic psychologists would come in is with psychological testing and a psychological interview. Now, testing and interviews are interesting, and we really haven't talked about this much yet in this class. And a huge part of the workload for a psychologist is often assessment. So, what could be problematic about an interview versus testing? And what we're really looking for is differentiating between reliability and validity. You probably heard this in a lot of your classes. But remember, reliability is synonymous with consistency, whereas validity is accuracy. So think of a bathroom scale. Every time you hop on that bathroom scale, you get roughly the same measurement over and over and over again. That's reliability. Are you going to get the same measurement? Accuracy is, does this measure what it says it's going to measure? So if we use the bathroom scale to measure weight, yeah, that's pretty accurate. If we said we're going to use the bathroom scale to measure intelligence or capability as a police officer, that's just ridiculous. That's not accurate at all. So that's validity. And with standardized testing procedures, you have a high degree of reliability and validity. If we're using a measure like that, those things have already been established through research. But a psychological interview is a little different. It depends on who the psychologist is. You can imagine that if each one of you in the class did an interview with a police officer to determine if they were a good candidate to become a police officer when they were in their training, you would have had very different results. How do you even know what questions to ask? And although we can increase reliability by using like semi-structured or structured interviews, oftentimes that's not done. So it can be problematic there, and what that leads to is a type 1 or type 2 errors, which you might remember from your statistics classes. That's a false positive or a false negative. So if I said, yes, this person is a good candidate to become a police officer, and they later get kicked off the police force, that's a false positive. Or if I reject a candidate and in fact they would have been a good police officer, that's a false negative. Now, the most frequently used measure of personality by psychologists in general, and with forensic psychologists with police, is the MMPI. That stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and we're on our second edition right now. That's why it's often referred to as the MMPI-2. If I just use MMPI instead of writing out MMPI-2, I mean the same thing. But there's other measures as well that are frequently used with police officers, far more so than this. But there's also the California Psychological Inventory, and then specific to civil servants is the Inwald Personality Inventory. Really, I have the most experience with the MMPI, so that's the one I'm going to talk about most extensively. So the MMPI is, maybe I'll attach it so you can see it as part of your course materials. But you get this booklet of questions, and they're really kind of weird questions. Like the first question says, I like mechanics magazines, true or false? You might ask yourself, what does that have to do with personality? Well, through the process of developing the test, the psychologists that put this together just wrote out a number of different questions, threw them into the middle of a table, and they put it together as part of the MMPI question booklet. So there's 567 questions. So look in your course content area. At some point I might post that. Now, what they did was they took those questions and administered it to a large group of people. And then those individuals with known pathology, their responses on some of those questions would kind of cluster together through different statistical procedures, which I don't really want to talk about today. However, the interesting thing is that the questions on the MMPI oftentimes don't have a lot of face validity. So you read the question and you might have no clue what it's actually asking. That's why the questions are a little weird. But those are correlated to specific pathology and personality. Now the MMPI will yield different personality scales. There's 10 scales, and then different validity scales. So let's look at those.